avalanches are a pretty low feedback environment. It's kind of binary. It's like everything goes well or things go really poorly.
Welcome to Mountain Routes Over Coffee, episode 6. In this episode, I talk with Aaron Trowbridge. Aaron reached out after I had shared a personal near miss, asking if he could share a few that he has had over the decades. In this episode, we're going to talk 3 near misses that Aaron has had in avalanche terrain. Aaron is a local to northern British Columbia, less than 100 kilometers from the Alaskan panhandle. He's been skiing and cruising around the alpine for many decades. If you're into spending time in the snow, especially in avalanche terrain, this is a must listen. We talked about some fairly advanced and, if performed poorly, dangerous techniques like ski cutting and belayed skiing. The best way to learn any of the techniques that we talk about is from a qualified professional. Do not take any advice for what you should do in the mountains from any video or podcast, and especially not from this one. Now, why am I doing this? Well, calls for search and rescue in the United States have tripled since 2016, with more than 60% of those calls being due to a lack of preparation. With more and more people spending time in the mountains, I wanted to share what I have learned about navigating in them and planning for success with you. The purpose of tactical alpinism is to increase your safety margin in the mountains so that you can go bigger, whatever way that looks like for you. For the Mountain Routes Over Coffee's episodes, we aim to enable your learning from afar by sharing best practices through conversations with industry experts, weekend warriors, and people just like you. If you're listening to this recording and not watching it on a video, in the show notes and in the description below, you can find links to the photos that we discuss throughout this episode.
Maybe some of my background might actually line up with I have no military background, but it was very much growing up in an analog world, pre-digital tools, and also a work focus. A lot of my early sort of field, bush, mountain, remote experience was more in a work context, which has a bit of a different, flavor to how you approach planning and what you're what you're trying to accomplish in a day. So I was kind of curious to see if there was any connection points with sort of more of that military background.
Sure. Yeah. What did getting into doing these outdoor things look like for you in the first place? Where'd you start?
Started early, family. My father got us out hiking, lots of backpacking in the Canadian Rockies, hiking locally, canoeing, and I would say by mid-teens, 15 or so, I started to own it. Didn't have to be a family trip at that point. Started finding, young adults, 20-year-olds who would be, or other mentors who would be willing to take out a teenager, and got a little bit more into the rock climbing, ice climbing, ski touring. Realized pretty early on that, you bump up into risk and pretty quickly. And bumbling your way into it wasn't a good idea. So it kind of latched on to mentors and professional ethos, I suppose. Some local mentors who happen to be professionals, and kind of dabbled with the idea of mountain guiding as a profession, but abandoned that pretty early on. But I would say really kind of held that ethos of loving the mountains, loving rivers, oceans, mountains. Those are kind of the 3 medium I really enjoy. And learning from, be they amateurs who have extensive experience or professionals, and drawing on everything you can to learn and stay alive and enjoy it.
Yeah. And your background sounds very similar to mine in that way. As I started climbing, and then a year later, I ended up in a place where I had 2 AMGA rock guides who were taking me around and showing me like what rock climbing is the right way.
Yeah, and even interviews, sharing of stories like this. I know that was one of the things I really enjoyed, was the campfire stories of people who, of their adventures and their partners over the years. So I always really enjoyed, sometimes climbing I had a love-hate relationship with climbing, where I loved the idea of it. I enjoyed a lot of it, but man, do you get into some situations where you question, what you've decided to do. And I'd say particularly at the top of a mountain, when you realize you still got to get back down the thing, and that's actually a lot harder than getting up it.
Yeah, especially if you're not skiing.
Yeah, especially if you're not skiing. Yeah, really. Yeah, skiing is a great way to get down mountains.
Yeah. So you mentioned some stories, and you reached out to me when I posted about a case study of my own about a near miss. So I'm curious what sort of stories you came on with. We haven't prepped any of them or talked to any of them before. So what's the big one or biggest one that you wanted to share?
Well, I don't know if they're necessarily big ones, but I've been reflecting in the last bunch of years about how to increase my skills, or drawing on what the sort of professional practice is, and realizing that the practice of debriefing, generally day to day, you don't have to have near misses, but near misses are a pretty acute version of that. Seem like a really effective way to increase your skills. And I'd say particularly in this ski touring environment, avalanches are a pretty low feedback environment. It's kind of binary. It's like everything goes well or things go really poorly. So it's, that practice of trying to get into the habit day to day with partners of debriefing is important. And I've been reflecting on near misses over the years, and feeling like, I guess, inspired partly by starting to see more in the social media world amongst professionals, more highlighting of near misses. So appreciated that story you posted. There was one of the premier AMGA guides out there on social media in the sort of tech tip world. I remember one day seeing him retract a post and some guidance because someone had pointed out some issues or flaws or better ways to do it. And I thought, oh, that's fantastic to actually see like industry leading figures acknowledging when they've made a mistake. And I think that's something that the recreational community of, I'm no professional in anything, the recreational community, I think, could really adopt that. So I got a few images here. Just give me a second to share a screen. I was going to start maybe just with an anecdote first on this one, where this incident goes back, probably over 20 years now. So some of the details are a little foggy. And this was in an era when I would say our communication and our teamwork and our planning was poor. And it was an area that we were pretty familiar with. And the other side of, are you able to see the screen now?
I am not seeing anything popping up yet.
Okay, forgive that. There we go. How's that?
Yep, seeing it now.
Yeah, this is in a local mountain range. Our community is just in the background there of this Google Earth image, Babine Mountains, and it's an area we pretty commonly ski toured in. There's a cabin in the valley behind this glacier, and this particular day, the ceiling had dropped, gotten windy, lost visibility, but we're really familiar with this relatively low angle glacier ski run, about 20-degree slope. And we spent lots of time on the adjacent slopes, more rock-bound couloirs and whatnot, and thought, okay, we got this nice cruisy 20-degree glacier run. We'll just meander down it. We can navigate this in a whiteout. We had skied it down to the base, and ironically, it was another injury where a friend was hitting an avocado huddled behind a big boulder in the moraine field, and sliced the web of her thumb and finger. And so while a friend was dealing with that, we were getting ready to head back up and out, and that delayed us long enough that by the time we had turned around and headed back up this moraine field in a whiteout, I was out front following our skin tracks, walked into a wall of fresh avalanche debris about 1.5 meters deep that had completely buried our tracks. And obviously that was pretty sobering. Learned a few things at that time, but clearly remember not have having a lot of active planning discussion with our group that day going into the day, nor really much of a debrief. I think it was a bit of a sober shock, and we got out of there and carried on. But in the intervening years, I've kind of looked back at this as one of those first moments that kind of shook me awake. And in this case, it was really kind of classic terrain familiarity. We thought we were comfortable navigating in the whiteout. We thought we could just manage the terrain, and we were smart enough to manage those hazards, but completely didn't think about the overhead hazard. One of the other issues that day was that it wasn't snowing; it was just windy and whiteout, and we did not think about just available wind-driven snow. We were thinking, oh, it's not actively snowing, we don't have to worry about new loading, and it pulled out a pretty significant slide that was in the matter of sort of 10 15 minutes where we would have been there.
Sure. And what direction is this couloir, or the glacier we're looking at, rather, facing?
Yeah, that purple avalanche sort of debris location would be northeast aspect, and
Okay.
classic, our prevailing winds in the storms are southeast, southwest. In this case, it would have been prime location for loading in the start zone.
Yeah, so on pretty much all the west coast of the United States, the winds are prevailing out of the west. And when Aaron's saying southwest wind, that's the direction the winds are starting from, because we don't know where the winds are going per se. But yeah, as we're looking here, what I'm seeing on the looker's right in the image he has up, for if you're not watching, is that there's a steeper, potentially corniced area that can definitely be an area to gather some wind loading.
Yeah, and we, losing the situational awareness of not having visibility, we were kind of just managing the terrain under our feet and not thinking about what was overhead, adjacent, and how far it could run out. Because honestly, it was a pretty long run out too. Like we were surprised that start zone. We were surprised that start zone generated that large of an avalanche.
Yeah. I mean, fresh wind loading happens pretty damn quick, and like I imagine you don't remember the wind speed that day, but
unpleasant strong.
Yeah, so 30, 40 miles per hour at least, then, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and I think we got a little complacent where this range is a bit of a continental climate where it's relatively low snow, shallow snowpack, lots of wind. So frequently all the surfaces are just really stiff wind slab. And I think we just sort of had this feeling like there wasn't enough snow available for transport because most snow surfaces were so hard. And without the visual clues of spindrift off the ridge or something, we just were making assumptions that weren't valid.
Sure. So I noticed that you mentioned a few contributing factors such as visibility, potentially some biases in there as well. So I'm curious what your takeaways were as you look back and debrief this.
Yeah, in this case, because this is very retrospective, because I don't remember being very active at the time, but this was in an era where hard maps were all we had. We didn't have digital planning tools, where we had a lot of terrain familiarity, and we'd already been in the area for a couple of days, and this was kind of a last day that we just had spent time here before. We thought we were familiar enough with it, and particularly familiar enough with it in a more extreme kind of context where we were used to being in the couloirs, we were used to being in sort of more substantive slopes, and just we're biased that this was a low angle gentle run, that we were confident we would not trigger an avalanche on that slope, but we did not take into account that conditions that day were actually moving into natural avalanche hazard.
For sure. And like depending on how heavy, wet, or how much like shear force, how much propagation force that those slopes have, they can travel quite a ways, as you showed here, where it came a pretty far way down the slope, even after it transitions to a lower angle.
Yeah, like if we had Cal Topo hill, slope shading on here, our track would be, it wouldn't even be sort of illuminated, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we really even discussed that day. I think we just kind of said, oh, let's go there, and didn't go through any methodological kind of assessment of, okay, what are the hazards? What are the issues with loss of visibility today? And those kind of Swiss cheese models where it takes sort of multiple failures usually to add up to an accident. We weren't paying attention to them all.
Yeah. And two things I'm gonna point out from what you're describing is, one, the expert halo is one of the sort of human factors, where it's like it sounds like y'all were comfortable enough with the area that you felt that nothing was going to be able to happen because you have that expertise in that area. And then the second one that I'm thinking is also survivorship bias, because and that's a common one in the avalanche space, is like, you don't trigger an avalanche on a moderate or considerable day, therefore you start to assume that you're not going to do so on the next moderate or considerable day. But it's really like every time it's a whole new game, and just because you survived once doesn't mean your decision making is accurate or correct.
Yeah, and I think that survivorship bias is a real issue in in this range in particular, because it is so wind hammered that you're often skiing on like 20 centimeters of snow over rock, or deep, really stiff wind slabs, and that those wind slabs have enough strength to carry your weight and stress. And I feel like, and again, I don't have evidence for this, but this has been sort of my head scratching, that I think we get away with a lot of descents in this range because the wind slab is so stiff, it carries our weight, and we're not quite exceeding that threshold. And so we have a surprising number of non-avalanche events in this range, given how kind of classic rocky snowpack like it is, where there are lots of basal weaknesses. And so I think I feel like we get away with a lot of not having an accident. Yeah.
And like, one life lost is too many. And like, I'm happy and surprised that we didn't have an issue in the Sierra this year, because we just went through a persistent weak layer cycle, and that persistent weak layer still exists at ground level. But in the Sierra, because it's such a heavy, wet snowpack, we aren't used to having persistent weak layers, because it's typically a warmer environment.
Yeah.
So this persistent weak layer is now under about 1.5 meters of snow in most areas. So it's too deep to trigger without like a cornice or a jump by a human. But as the snowpack thins, it'll become active again. And I'm hoping people continue to make good decisions. But from watching some of the videos and whatnot over the past 2 weeks here in this area, like, people were definitely still sending it.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of the near misses that I've been starting to recall have multiple layers of what's stacking up. And the last one I'll share, I've got two more with a little bit more detail. We're kind of pushing a few factors that we know are a problem. We knew it was windy. We knew there was poor visibility. Those are kind of a couple strikes that, just don't set you up with nearly as much of a margin. And I really, reflecting a lot on the notion that through skill or experience or technical tools that you can sort of outsmart or outmanage the problem. And I don't think that should be the default strategy. Like, you want to sort of save all of those tools in the toolkit for getting yourself out of a situation that's gotten worse, rather than stumbling, like thinking that you can outsmart a problem and operate on the margin's edge.
Yeah, and something that I don't remember who said it, but that I heard a while back and still use, is it takes 1,000 yeses to do the climb or do the ski, but it only takes one no to turn around.
Yeah.
And that I hope more people use that type of framework moving forward, because like you can get into that confirmation bias area where it's like you see one thing that's right in the direction you want to go, and so you decide to go into a more hazardous situation.
Yeah, and I think that kind of lines up with how I think often about my favorite partners now. My favorite partners are the ones that, a portion of the year we're all just fine with meadow skipping or keeping it, really low risk. We're also game and keen to take on some bigger, higher risk, more substantive objective, but to walk away from it in a moment and just bail out on that option and go back to plan, DEF, and there's no drama, there's no angst about that. And on the rare day, or the day where everything lines up, that you can do something that feels substantive, but that nobody's fixated on it. So definitely very thoughtful about who my partners are, and managing or choosing your day, also to really line up with your partners, and being very conscious about when you're stepping into these more burly environments.
And something I've been hearing very commonly is I don't have any partners, or I don't know how to find good partners near me. So for you, what is a good partner?
Well, it's a range of, I do want people who have, well, the partner need depends on what your objective is. So I would rather be out with people who are comfortable communicating, and have kind of the soft skills of interaction, where we can talk honestly about what are our goals for the day, what, are we in alignment in our fitness, in our objectives, in our mood, and then the sort of technical skills, I suppose, scale to how substantive the objective is, and certainly looking for people who take those technical skills seriously and practice them, whether it's through formal training or not. But do expect that people not necessarily know everything, but are keen for the journey and are constantly trying to improve themselves. That is same ethos I try to bring to it. I'm certainly no expert, but people who recognize their limits and try to keep investing in improving themselves, and are open to what they do and don't know. But again, at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to the ability to communicate, when in the lead up and in the execution and in the debrief. Like, are we comfortable? Are we comfortable enough with each other, trusting each other, being vulnerable, being honest, that we can say no, and we'll listen to each other, that we can identify concerns, that we can keep navigating all the decisions that have to be made, and not that be a really stressful thing, be it something that is relatively easy to do, and doesn't take a lot of struggle to communicate.
Yeah, when all the signs are pointing to yes, like you have the conditions, you have the partner, you have the fitness, you have the route picked, you hit it at the right time of day, like all those things are like green check marks, and you're good to go. Like that, those are the easy decisions.
Those are the easy ones, yeah.
And where it gets harder is when like some of those start turning into like yellow handshakes or yellow maybes. And for me, one example is I was skiing a couloir with a friend, and we get halfway up it, and it's just wind packed hardboard, like barely edgeable. And we're halfway up, we're out of a 4,500 vertical foot day. We have maybe 500 to 1,000 more feet of climbing to do, if even. And he's like, "Hey, I'm not feeling this. Like, can we transition?" It's like, yeah. And the way I treat partners is like, hey, if one person's not feeling it anymore, like maybe we'll have a discussion about it, and just to get a little bit more clarity. But if somebody says they're not feeling it, then the best way to be a supportive partner, in my opinion, is to be like, yeah, let's do it. Like you don't want to like force somebody or cajole somebody into a bad decision.
No, no. And, there's a few quotes that are jumping out at me from, the Ski Guide Manual, I think is a really good recent publication that I've enjoyed reading in the last year or so.
Do you know who that's put
And
out by?
yeah, and forgiving me, his last name, I'm not quite sure the pronunciation, but it's Rob
Okay.
Coppolillo. He's an American guide, I think just relocated back from Europe to the Pacific Northwest. He was also the lead author on the Mountain Guide Manual, both from Falcon, both great books. And the Ski Guide Manual does a really good job of synthesizing a lot of the modern kind of human behavior decision making. And one of the quotes that jumps out at me, I don't know who it's from, is this idea of strong opinions weakly held. And I think that's both in like the detail of decision making. It's okay to have an idea, a thesis about the conditions or the hazard or the trend, but be ready to let go of that if you have new information or new evidence or their perspectives. But I think that's also the case with partners and objectives, where it's like my favorite partners have been ones who are game for some type 2 plus fun, some kind of bold adventure, like, hey, let's go ski this super cool thing. And for whatever reason during the day, one or both of us aren't feeling it, then it's just like, yeah, let's just change plans and go, lay on this rock in the sun, or ski these meadows, and there's no angst. And one of the other quotes in this Ski Guide Manual, no, sorry, I think it's from Carl Claassen, who's a really key Avalanche figure in Canada. And I think it may have been on the Powder Cloud, which is a really great Canadian website that's really supporting Avalanche education. And his, oh my goodness, I just completely blanked out on it now. Oh, sorry. If you're spending more than 2 or 3 minutes deliberating over something, you should just take that as a no. Don't try to outthink, outsmart, list. Like, if you're going down a path where you have concerns and you're starting to like overanalyze the situation, just take that as a sign that you should probably take the conservative choice. Don't overthink it.
Yeah, for me, that's a sign that like something's out of alignment with my beliefs or values when I'm trying. And it's like a sign of trying to force something when you're deliberating over something or anxious over something for a long period of time. And like you have to identify what it is. And sometimes it is like you need to make a decision, and it's the decision you don't want to make.
And I think it's recognizes that there's probably a bunch of uncertainty at play. And I mean, the mountains, snow, avalanches are like an uncertain enough environment. Like, who am I to think that I can outthink, outsmart this avalanche problem? I don't have enough knowledge or experience to definitively decide.
Yeah, for sure. I'd argue none of us do. Like, it's all individual data points.
Yeah.
That we're working with and like, for example, there's a case study, I believe last year in Montana, where they dug a snow pit and then 100 meters later stepped out onto 100 meters higher, stepped out onto a slope, and the whole thing slid.
Yeah.
And it was like that. It's a single data point. And
Yeah.
that's how avalanche forecasts get more accurate, is by having thousands of data points. But even the forecasters, they're 1 to like maybe 20 observations or data points during the day.
I think I remember reading an anecdote in an earlier avalanche manual from the 80s describing a similar situation in Europe where guides were analyzing a snow profile, and the entire slope around them avalanched and left them in their profile standing there.
Yep.
Yeah.
They dug their own grave that luckily didn't turn into a grave.
Yeah.
So you pulled up another shot here.
Yeah, another shot here. This was another one. This one wasn't poor weather, but this is one a few years ago where with one of my core partners and kind of farther on in my evolution, where we are starting to do a lot more trip planning. We are being very much proactive. We are having really good conversations. We are debriefing. So I feel like, we've put into place a lot of the practices that are good, but still had a near miss. And in retrospect, found a bunch of failures in our judgment. This is still in the same region, west of Smithers, but in a much deeper snowpack part of our landscape.
And what's the mountain range?
This would be called the Ashman Ridge Paleo Peak area. That would be a very local name, but this is getting just on the lee side of our coast mountains, and we probably get twice the snowfall that we do even 60 kilometers west. A lot of microclimates in our local ranges that really vary from kind of almost coastal to intermontane to continental. This is a Google Earth image, so the snow, the imagery doesn't reflect our day there, but we happen to be out early season. It's a location that often we can drive on logging roads to a fairly high elevation early season and not need snowmobiles to get in. That would be pretty much a true northwest aspect, where you ascend on the south side and drop over this basin, and there's some relatively gentle tree runs. We skied the green line first, ascended the red line, and then our second run was the blue line. And as we ascended, it was going to be our last climb back out to head back to the truck. As we were ascending that red route, came across a slide covering our tracks in purple. And there had been another ski party that in the intervening time that we had been there, going up and down, had skied down the center between our two descent routes, and ski cut triggered a small avalanche that overran our tracks. It wasn't large, but what in and of itself, it wasn't they basically ski cut it unintentionally, weren't involved. But there were some really interesting, and sobering factors there. It was buried surface hoar that was quite variably scattered at tree line. The higher elevation probably had been affected by wind. Our winds tend to be strong enough that often our snow deposition is a little bit below the ridge lines, and right at what you might think is the classic start zone is actually still kind of wind scoured and either really stiff or scoured, or the surface hoar has been beaten down. So there's this little pocket of surface hoar. It pulled out some really low angle terrain on the lateral side. And what we realized is that our first two runs were not the most conservative route. They were slightly more exposed, both in some steep locations. Some of these exclamation marks would sort of identify, a slightly steeper roll that would be similar to what did end up sliding. And there's really no reason why there shouldn't have been surface hoar in those locations, or maybe there was and we just didn't trigger it. And we also exposed ourselves to some terrain traps. Lower down on the green route, there was a gully feature similar on the blue route. If that had slid, we would have been pushed down into a bit of a terrain trap, and really feeling like these isolated pockets of triggerable buried surface hoar. We just got lucky that we didn't hit one and get ourselves involved in a piece of terrain that had more significant terrain trap consequences than what this other party did, which had a bit of a nice gentle run out, and the debris didn't pile up in any terrain trap.
Yeah, for sure. And like surface hoar, for those that aren't familiar with it, it kind of looks like feathers sticking up off the snow, and it can be super, super small, or it can be a few inches, even up to a few inches in size. It's also super delicate, but when it gets buried, it ends up acting kind of like champagne glasses, where it can take a lot of load straight down, but as soon as you put a shear force or sideways pressure on it, like a skier loading a angled slope, then it breaks really, really easily. So like what I'm noticing here is like the areas that you marked outside of what slid look like they could be a little bit more wind exposed, because there's kind of a bowl of trees where your slide did start. So I'm wondering if that surface hoar was protected just enough by the trees to not be blown over before that next layer of snow fell.
I think that's quite likely that, sometimes surface horror gets buried and it's widespread, and other times I think like this, it's quite it's quite isolated. Um, and unless you're, a guide out there operating a hut and you're, watching it day in and day out, and you know exactly how the patterns evolved as a recreationalist coming out on a weekend, like we don't know. We can just make best guesses. And in that kind of situation, it's really hard to know where, and it's probably more luck whether you hit it or not. And in this case, I think we probably got lucky, not triggering it. And if we had triggered it, there would have been a much higher consequence than if we had skied what honestly we knew was the most conservative line, which that other group did, and still happened to trigger it. That was a more conservative route. It had less consequence.
Yeah. So I mean,
So
you got looks like you got 2 good runs in, and then going back up for the third rather is when you had that. So I mean, that just circling back to what we talked about before with like that little bit of survivorship too, because you wouldn't have known. I mean, really in both of the cases, if you hadn't gone for an additional lap, you wouldn't have even known.
We wouldn't have even known. And honestly, if that other group hadn't have skied it, I doubt our up track would not have triggered it. So
Sure.
we could have easily left that day with zero feedback that we were on a margin. We could have easily gone home that day and thought, oh, we made good decisions all day. And in this case, it was like, oh, actually, we didn't. we got lucky. And it's not often that you get that kind of relatively low consequence feedback.
For sure. Yeah. And one last thing I noticed is there was one piece of the Avalanche that sort of went a little higher in that second, I believe the second image you had. And yeah, the right picture where there's a little bit of higher point. And I wonder if, because that's right at a convex roll, it looks like, where it rolls over from flatter to steeper terrain. And there are the snowpacks under more tension. So I wonder if that's where it was started. Is that where it was started?
So you can see an entrance track here of the pier.
Got it.
This is where they would have triggered it. And I made a point of taking this photo because like this really was the classic kind of, slightly over 30-degree roll, classic trigger location. And like you said, is a nice protected pocket from the prevailing winds to preserve that surface horror. But the debris ran down and it started to pull out on the side here in relatively low angle terrain. Like this is more like 20-degree terrain down here. And I've seen this a few times now where it's amazing how low angle of terrain a buried surface horror layer can run in. And the times I've seen it, it was another trigger. It was actually avalanches above pulling out much larger terrain below that normally would be too shallow to slide naturally, or probably even skier trigger in this case. I think it probably took the force of that upper avalanche to kind of pull out the stuff below. But again, good feedback on how different types of avalanche problems behave differently, and buried surface horror can do some slightly different things.
For sure. Yeah. And as you said, it's in pockets. So like 100 meters to the east or west, you would have had a potential different reaction from the snowpack.
Yeah, which literally we did in this case. Our other tracks were within 150 meters of either side. And I guess what I worry about, or my kind of take home is, I'm going to assume that our descents in those other locations could have been within 5-10 meters of hitting the sweet spot. And sometimes you can hit a little sweet spot that pulls out terrain that you just skied, and you didn't trigger it in that location, but when you hit the sweet spot, so we got lucky. And if you hit a sweet spot, it can pull out a large enough avalanche that it is much more problematic. Like those other slopes were much more connected. So if you had hit a sweet spot, you could have easily propagated something much larger than what happened in the one that did slide.
For sure. And you said during this one, you did have a debrief. Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah. Well, in one of my other sort of takeaways, I think I had it was early season, it was shallow snowpack, it was short days. So, you just sort of always know that shallow early season snowpacks are not as stable. And if something happens, we're working with not a lot of light. We're at like 52 degrees north latitude, and in December, that's not a lot of light. So, the likelihood of helicopters, of anyone getting and helping you that day is limited. And there was also only two of us. So the margin of responding to an accident, be that a burial or an injury, with one able partner, that's not a large margin. And I don't like skiing with large groups, but 3 or 4 people is pretty nice to have that kind of that support if you do need help. And like I said earlier, we didn't ski the easiest line first. We took slightly bolder choices. And in that case, we didn't really talk about that at the beginning. We didn't explicitly say, are we consciously choosing this slightly steeper line? Why? If so, why? I think we kind of got drawn into it.
Yeah, and something else I've noticed that you've said in both this one and the past one was that they're both early season. How did that play into your decision making to go for these two different objectives we've talked?
Well, I think at a meso macro scale, we chose this range because it had more snow than other ranges in an early season. It has, a bit more snow. It's still an early season snowpack relative to that location. And then at kind of a meso scale, we knew that we weren't going up to the peak top and skiing a larger alpine run. We chose this sort of central treed rib as at that kind of meso scale as a more conservative general location. But when it came to our micro route selection, we didn't drill that down to like the easiest micro route. We took a slightly more aggressive micro route.
Sure. Yeah, I'm also wondering about sort of your motivation for getting out, because I know when the snow first hits early season, there's good conditions. I want to get out there sooner. And
Yeah.
It's arguably the better time to pull the reins back because you haven't been skiing for a while and you're really excited.
For sure. And, like we were, as soon as the snow does start to really fall, these roads close down and you need a snow and be able to get in. My partner and I don't have it. So we were, trying to make hay while the roads were, were open. And it's not often we get out to this location, and the skiing was really, really good. So we thought, okay, we're in the slightly more conservative portion of it. Let's enjoy it.
Yeah. Awesome. And do you have another one or two, or are these the two you picked out?
I got one more queued up that this one was actually just this spring. And I certainly had a lot of lessons for me as well. We're back into this Babine range. This sort of massif is called Mount Highland. And is my cursor visible?
Yes.
Okay. This route doesn't have a name, but it's this really elegant ramp, slight couloir feature off the ridge line. It's quite protected from wind. So while most of this range is wind hammered, the 2 times I had been here previous to this spring have been some of the best skiing I've ever had. And I've sprinkled a few photographs in from other trips just to give you sort of a sense of the terrain and our motivations for the biases that we had. It's also a really fun kind of classic spring ski mountaineering day where you've got a fun alpine kind of traverse to get to there. You've got a really fun ski mountaineering feeling objective, and then a nice loop coming out a completely different valley back to your vehicle. So it's just a really classic day. Again, northeast aspect. This is on the approach ridge, which will start to be important to get us some context, because the day we were there this spring, we also lost visibility. But you have to navigate a fairly narrow ridge for a period of time that has a lot of aspect changes. And in good visibility, it's all pretty straightforward. This isn't like, knife edge climbing ridge, but in loss of, when you lose visibility, you are near hazards on both sides, and these subtle aspect and slope changes are really confusing when you don't have visibility. This is the entrance to that route. One of the beautiful things about it is that while it's very much lee to the prevailing winds, it doesn't form cornices directly on the entrance, certainly adjacent, but not directly on it. So you've got a nice platform to play with, and do a belayed ski cut or what you want on the top. This is what the first time skied it. And again, it's not, a crazy steep couloir. It's probably, 38, 40 degrees at the very top, and then getting down to kind of 35, 30 for the majority of it. But the day, and this is looking partway down here, you can see this sort of sunlit knob with the shadows is a really nice regroup location halfway down, that is well off to the side, kind of out of the line of fire. And again, the 2 times I'd skied it previously, and this is part of the bias, were just absolutely amazing boot top powder, when the rest of the range or the sort of solar aspects that day were crusty and wind scoured. Just a little gem of protected skiing. But the day we went in this spring, there were a bunch of different things that sort of led up to again, some sober reflections, which I'll describe more in a couple more slides. But the long story is, we had, no, I'll start at the beginning. We had planned kind of an alpine start, like a 5 a.m. wake up, and somehow I slept through an alarm. And when I woke up at 6 a.m., I thought, oh no, I've botched the day. Checked my text messages, and my partners had been out at the trailhead, and so I knew they were kind of out and they were going to spend a day skiing. So I thought I'll drive out there and I'll leave a few beers and a little present for them and an apology note for having botched the start of our day. Got out to the
returning to the good partner question. I think that's a good partner.
Yeah. That was all my fault. I don't know what happened there. But when I got to their vehicle, in a location that should have been a complete cell phone hole of no reception, my phone rang and they said, hey, we're just at tree line. Why don't you catch up to us and we'll do something. We'll salvage the day. And I had all my gear prepped in the vehicle. And I thought, okay, well, I'll join them for something that day, and managed to catch up to them. But we were probably about a solid 2 hours behind what we were planning on for a departure. And we were wanting to manage solar warming. We thought it was going to be a sunnier day. We thought it was going to be a bit of broken cloud, but this is in late April, and when you do get any sun, the solar warming comes on quickly. But the ceiling really thickened up and dropped, and all of a sudden there was no sun that day. And so when I caught up to them, we all kind of thought we were going to abandon our original plan. But as we started moving, we thought, oh, we could shave a little bit off of this leg of the route, shorten that little detour, and we don't have solar warming today. So maybe we've been given a bit of a window here where our early start, our failure to have an early start doesn't matter as much. So we carried on up to the ridge and did get onto the ridge top in reasonable visibility, and then the fog just socked in, and we went from a higher ceiling to zero visibility. And out come the cordlet on the end of the ski pole, and we're fly fishing our way down the ridge, checking for steep drops and cornices, and had both the map, compass, and GPS out because of all of these subtle aspect changes. The GPS comes in awfully handy with digital maps that are preloaded with our route. And again, because I'd been there twice in the winter and a couple times in the summer, I was like, oh, I know this route. I think we can successfully navigate the whiteout portion of it. And sure enough, we did. We pieced that together, and didn't have any close calls on the navigation. Got to our entrance. and we knew the potential avalanche problem that day. I think the hazard was rated moderate, low, low for alpine, tree line, and below tree line. And that moderate alpine was based on isolated pockets of wind slab on this aspect. It had snowed about 10 centimeters a couple days before, not a huge snowfall. And we knew there had been wind. So we were expecting wind slab on the very aspect, the exact slope that we were going to ski. And we busted out the rope and did a belayed ski cut for my partner, who you can see there. And in the upper part of this photo, you can see these are his ski tracks. That's the ski penetration. The actual slab depth is kind of highlighted in darker orange there. And he just walked about 15 feet out onto the slope, and right at his feet triggered a small wind slab. And it was obviously not unexpected, because we knew that was kind of the potential avalanche problem. We belayed him out there for that very reason. But then when it actually happens and you realize, okay, did we do the right thing by anticipating it and belaying him out there, or is that actually kind of starting to get over the margin where that's not meant to be like, are we starting to play right at the margin of our techniques and our technical solutions to the problem? And nothing went wrong, but when you look at the run out, it ran down pretty much the full length. We were kind of calling it size 1.5.
Yeah, like would have maybe buried a person.
I think if somebody was in an awkward position in the wrong point in the debris, they could have been buried. It would have been a shallow burial. We knew there were no real choke terrain traps for depth, and no cliffs or anything to get pushed off. So it is a relatively clean run out for a run of this. It's still a pretty big slope. But all of those rationales of relatively planar run out, no real big terrain trap, no cliffs, belayed ski cut, still felt like a lot of rationalization that kind of pushed us right up to the margin of what, you're on the tipping point of it really not being a good outcome or a good idea. So I think it wasn't so much a failure where we got really surprised. It was more of a reckoning of, is this how close to the kind of margin we want to play? Is this our risk threshold that we're comfortable? This probably shouldn't be the norm, where we feel like, oh, we've got this problem figured out. We know how to do a belayed ski cut. That shouldn't be sort of our normal operating style, and have results like this. It kind of worked out, but probably overall we should back off, especially when there were a bunch of yellow flags going into the day of a delayed departure. Our original plan was, we were hours behind it. When it started to matter in terms of situational awareness, we lost visibility. Were there any natural avalanches on a similar aspect as we got onto that ridge? We don't know, because we didn't have the visibility as we got to there. And again, we're going up onto a high alpine ridge where there's not a lot of other bailout options necessarily. So you're kind of constraining what your bailout options are.
Sure. Yeah. So looking at this, like there are things that went right, and there are things that I imagine you would do or that you would change looking back at this day. And I'm curious, you said that the avalanche forecast was moderate above tree line, which were above tree line, and then it was on this aspect. So can you talk me through the decision to go for this objective that you wanted to ski?
I think, we had in our, a couple of things there. One, the snowfall about, I think it was about 2 or 3 days previously, had been about 10 centimeters. So in the spring, kind of just enough to recoat those north aspects where you get that, those nice little surprise spring stashes on a north face.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah. And we were thinking, okay, it's had a couple days. Wind slab often stabilizes relatively quickly.
Mhm.
We're familiar with the slope. We'll do this belayed ski cut at the top. Um, and so I think we kind of thought that I think we were sort of trying to outsmart it and thinking it's had enough time. We can assess it when we're there. We can do a belayed ski cut. And the bias of having been there twice before when it was unconsolidated powder with no slab properties. And I think what actually kind of, and again, I don't know if I'm making this up, but I was thinking more about this day. I almost think that in this situation, a clear sunny day would have been better. I think there would have been a stronger difference in temperature between the solar aspect and the north aspect. And I think with the low cloud cover, when we got here, we were like, wow, it is strangely warm. Like we were in a greenhouse. And I don't think we took into account that maybe on those bright sunny spring days, the north face actually kind of preserves that overnight cooling and cooler temperature. And in fact, today when we thought that the loss of the sun was actually a helpful thing, because it wasn't going to warm. In fact, what happened is we just got the cloud cover trapping heat, and it was actually quite warm, and it was a lot warmer than we were expecting. And I think that warmth gave the snow just enough cohesion to really form a nice, just enough of a cohesive slab to be really sensitive to triggering. And I think it was sitting on a old, fairly hard surface from, we were in kind of the classic spring cycle, where things were starting to generally get firmer, and we'd had this little refresh. And so I think we had thought the loss of sun was going to do one thing, and I actually think maybe it did the opposite of what we're expecting, was to actually warm the snow enough on a north aspect.
Sure.
Again, just a theory. Don't know if it's right or not, but
Yeah. Well, I do really appreciate you sharing the uh, example or case study near misses that you have, and luckily they've all been near misses for you, that you've shared here. And
yeah.
I like, so that's a good thing, and I really appreciate you sharing the lessons you've learned. I'm curious, like looking back at this, like looking back at these three, and then just from your experience of decades in the backcountry, what would you say like one like continue doing thing that y'all did was, and then what's one that you would definitely change or recommend others change that are looking at getting into this?
Um, in these last couple of examples, what I really liked was that our partnership was such that our debriefing about it was pretty honest, and that our kind of technical understanding of the situation was well matched with um, being honest about more of our emotional bias kind of part of it. And we had good debriefs, and I think we came away with like a good understanding that how we would adjust into the future, and just be um, cognizant of outthinking the problem. We're all pretty experienced, knowledgeable people with a lot of different mountain experience, but that it's easy to take a really rational approach, that you think you're making the right decision because you have some clear rationale for it. When we were kind of ignoring things, that if we'd been a little bit more honest and thinking a little bit more broadly, we were ignoring some just basic patterns of not pushing early season, just basic behaviors, like if you're going to start pushing visibility and steeper terrain, just recognize that all of those are kind of one rung up the ladder of consequences increasing. So yeah, the one sort of positive was, I think we had some good honest discussions that will be useful for changing our behavior in the future. And the one sort of takeaway on what we didn't do right was recognize when you're starting to stack up multiple odds not in your favor, and be clear that you are inching towards the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that, because like one no or one maybe, hopefully equals a no, I'm not going for it. And as you get more and more of those, which it sounds like on each of these days, you did have a few instead of just one when each of these incidences or these slides happened.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep. And our skill and our brains and our, our rational mind and our tools of ropes and all of those sort of fancy, more technical tools only get you so far. They don't replace just good, practical, consistent sort of risk management behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, they are risk mitigation tools, and I would argue that like having a rope can, or like some of the other mitigation tools, can make us go for riskier things. Same thing you see with when people wear their avalanche airbags.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like,
no, we actually sort of have been specifically scratching our head about, boy, like belayed ski cuts are a really valuable tool, but how do we not start? We should probably start using it more, but we don't want to think that it suddenly solves all of our problems. So how do we not let it our sort of risk tolerance scope creep because we think it's going to protect us all the time? So it's a tricky edge.
yeah, and I think like, because I believe so, the Colorado Avalanche Center this week put out a statistic saying that over 50% of the avalanches recorded in Colorado, or the injuries, or excuse me, skiers involved in avalanches over the past few years, more than 50% of them have been on moderate days, 2 out of 5.
And I think
And
yeah, and I
and
think a
like,
particular
I
stat.
think that's a perfect time to use some of these tools, because you are trying to gather more data, knowing that by choosing to do a belayed ski cut, you are increasing your risk as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point on kind of the stats there on the hazard levels. And I think I've heard in the same statistics that more and more experienced people are showing up as the accident victims, which is kind of sobering for myself as well, right? It's not. I think the general avalanche education and whatnot is really helping prevent people from stumbling into avalanches over their head. But what that maybe means is that those with more experience or training are they're not invulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I had some things, I had something that I was doing incorrectly pointed out to me by our lead guide, that I was like, I had forgotten about some of the standards for the tap test, for the compression tests and the ECT according to the swag.
Yeah.
Which is the guidelines for all these different tests. And it just been because it'd been over a decade since I'd taken an ARI level 1.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting in and shadowing some of those recreational level courses again, which I hadn't touched in a decade.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm connecting back with a bunch of information. I'm always feeling like there's room to rehone skills, either learn new ones or rehone old ones that you may not even realize you've gotten rusty on.
Yeah. I really appreciate your time today, Aaron. Is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to touch before we close out?
No, just thank you and others. I have a love-hate relationship with the world of social media, but I really value, there's a lot of people, yourself included, who are putting effort into creating useful educational content. And I think that's just think back to when I started all of these activities, how little information there was. And it really is a golden opportunity these days to take advantage of all sorts of educational tools. So appreciate the effort you're putting into this.
Yeah. Thank you very much.